Mm-hmm.
Because I think we always want to be fully funded. And I don't think the Lord asks us to be fully funded. Sometimes we want to social out on that.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what he charged the 72 with, right? Don't take money, don't take extra change of clothes or a staff or sandals, and depend on the goodness of others because the worker, is deserving of his wages. That's exactly what Jesus charges us with. And the part about perfect knowledge, we can spend the rest of our lives, using it as a deflection. It's a convenient excuse, right, to say, I just don't know enough yet. But I can spend my entire life in Scripture and say, well, I don't have it all quite yet, so I can't go out and be that. But we can be Christ in the lives of others just through the way we conduct ourselves, right? You can sense somebody's different by the way they carry themselves, conduct themselves, the way they speak, the way they react to negative situations. Those are all opportunities to raise someone's curiosity as to why you're different. Thank you, Mark.
Sterling, can I share
Sure.
an example of how this person of peace works?
Please.
It works all the time in Zambia for those who go out and plant churches. I went with a team of Zambian evangelists when we were living there. And this is how we would do it. They would see that an area needed a church. So we would go out there on a weekend to a village area, and a person of peace would let us stay at their village. We would go, you can stay here, and then we'd have a Bible study that night around the campfire. People would come at the person of peace place. He was being hospitable to us. That was the person of peace. Find a person who is hospitable and willing to invite you into his home and let you stay there and take care of your needs. That's why you don't take a bunch of stuff with you. You just take the bare minimum. So God surfaces, it's all God. God surfaces that person of peace. That's for the evangelists, the church planters to see. Oh, this is where God wants us to be. And it establishes a stronghold for God. And we kept going back there, and then through those sharing the gospel, people became Christians. And it got to be a nucleus of 5 or 6 people who were Christians there, and they started worshiping, and eventually a church started. So you start teaching them how to do assemblies and all that time, and it all happens with that person of peace who invited you to stay in his little compound, his little village for that weekend.
Thank you. That's great. That's a great example. And as you were talking, it came to mind too. Who did Jesus, himself often accept food from? For example, he went, ate with the tax collectors and the sinners. He wasn't seeking out, somebody who I'll be proud to be seen with, or it's okay to be seen eating with that person because everybody knows, that person is okay to eat with. He was willing to accept, that peaceful offering from the tax collector, for example, or whomever, because it opened a door, an opportunity to share, and we need to be challenged in that same way. Thank you very much, David. Others? Okay, so now we're going to transition into the story of the raising of Lazarus. Fascinating example here of Jesus' power over nature, and really underscores, another example of his divine power, yet a man. So here we go. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "The sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days, and then said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." That last verse there, isn't it interesting that Thomas is ready to go, die with him, but yet later, we only generally talk about Thomas, in the negative sense as the doubter, but his commitment to Christ is obvious here. So a little side note, and that's all for free. The summons by the sisters, Lazarus is sick. So they're asking Jesus to come, and they've seen his power, right? They know, they believe in Jesus. They know he can heal sickness. And the delay, it was about 25 miles, a solid day's journey from where Jesus was in Bethany. So the comfort for the sisters. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So note, he recognized the reality of death and grieving, and he did not shun sorrow. He was often found among the sad, and there was empathy there. Good reminder to us to not avoid interacting with those who are in sorrow. It's uncomfortable, right? It's hard, but we shouldn't avoid those opportunities to provide comfort and compassion in the lives of other people. That's something I thought was interesting. Does anybody else know what Lazarus' name means? His name means God will help. So isn't that interesting? Before he was even born, a name had been chosen, obviously, of Lazarus that means God will help, and certainly that comes to pass. He did not make light of sorrow, even though he knew it would soon be turned to joy, and he shared their sorrow because he wept. Isn't that interesting that he knew exactly what he was going to do? He knew how the story was going to end, but yet he could not help but share in their sorrow. He felt their hurt. He felt their need, and he was brought so deep in compassion for them that he wept. how it's kind of a heart check for us. How are we doing when we see somebody or a group of people are deeply grieved? Do we avoid them? Do we engage with them? Are we so hardened in heart that we can't bring ourselves to share in their sorrow like Jesus did? Just kind of a good reminder to us to do a heart check. And he spoke wonderful words of consolation, assuring them of Lazarus' resurrection, though obviously they are thinking in terms of a kingdom, being raised to life, at the resurrection. Jesus once more moved deeply, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, "the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So there's another, powerful moment, where Jesus asked them to believe. Do you believe? We often see that, request of acknowledgement of faith right before the miracle being performed. Thank you for that. Now that you say that, I do remember that, and I do think it was Wilbur that taught that. Thank you for that reminder. That's right. I was trying to remember. I had jotted down another thought on that, but I can't. Yes. Thank you, Jim. Very well said. Very well said. And I did find, as you were talking, it reminded me of what I was trying to think of, and it was kind of along the lines of what you just said. But many scholars argue, and I think, but just based on what Jim just said, could be argued. But many scholars do believe that aside from Jesus' own resurrection, that this was the most impactful miracle performed during Jesus' time on earth. Some would argue the feeding of the 5,000 was a bigger event, but many would point to the fact that he raised Lazarus for the reasons Jim just gave as being the most impactful miracle that he performed in his physical body before his own resurrection from the tomb.
There's just so many lessons that people learn from this. The feeding of the 5,000 was a wonderful miracle and everything. It showed that he could produce mass quantities of food from a very small amount. But it's just like grieving. I always had this thought in my head that why are we grieving so much when we're going to heaven? I think thinking that in my silliness that's kind of a
I'm glad you brought that up, Mark. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and that's such a, oftentimes it's nothing, that gets reduced to nothing more than a trivia question, right? What's the shortest, scripture, in the Bible? And it gets reduced to a trivia question. But you're right, it shows that the legitimacy of sorrow, of legitimacy of grief, love that can be expressed to someone who's grieving by sharing in that grief with them. So that's a really empowering verse, short, but very empowering because it speaks to the humanity of Christ as well. And again, we have to be very careful not to allow ourselves to become so callous and self-protecting. And it's somewhat a selfish thing, I think, to avoid sharing in sorrow and grief with others. I've known a few people in my life who would say, "Well, I don't go to funerals because they're too sad," or I don't, that's to me kind of a selfish behavior. I should be willing to be vulnerable and share in that sorrow and help carry that burden of grief. So thank you for that, Mark. Any other thoughts? Been a great discussion this morning. Okay, so the chief priests and the Pharisees plotted to kill Jesus. Here in verse 45, therefore many of the Jews had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did and believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as the high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So now we see the hatred of Jesus in full bloom. We've seen the resentment and the hatred, over and over again, but it has finally come to a head, right? They can't take anymore. They've had it. They feel threatened. In that verse right here, verse 48, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will style, they're going to root it out of their culture. We look at the different parts of the world where the Bible is banned. You can be killed in some countries for believing in God and expressing that, because really it ties back to this right here. They don't want to be subservient to anyone. They don't want to acknowledge anyone beyond their own power, their own limits. So the hatred of Jesus is by his enemies, full bloom. The raising of Lazarus did nothing to help the situation because now, here's this incredible miracle of, this it's causing more people to believe. The motive that stirred them, as we talked about, was jealousy, of course, and then the suggestion of the high priest there in verses 49-50. I think it's interesting, too, when Satan is unable to answer an argument, his response has often been, kill the witness. So you think about the situation, with Stephen. Let's just put an end to this. So what does he do with Jesus? He's going to enable, the ending of Jesus' life as well.